So first up, I'm going to spend around 10 minutes just talking about the role of evidence in clinical practice. And actually what I want to address with you tonight is really how, as a Chief Medical Officer, I look at device performance holistically. So the background for this is pretty straightforward. You'll all be aware that the AFX product family has had some challenges, particularly the initial graft, the AFX system with Strata, had a higher type 3 endoleak rate than was anticipated when the graft launched, and that's been rectified with manufacturing changes in structure to the PTFE, with the newer grafts being the AFX system with DuraPly and then the current commercialized product AFX2. So as a CMO, the question that I'm asked by you guys often in the field, but also internally and by our regulators, is how do you assess the performance of the current commercial graft, and how do you know that this graft is performing as it was designed? So this is really how I look at it when I think about what data are required to evaluate medical device performance. For me, those data have to be empirically based. They've really got to be evidence-led. And if you think about what evidence one needs to look at graft performance, those data really have to be relevant and they have to be reliable. And the constituents of reliability for me are that the data sets have to be valid, they have to be verifiable, and certainly they have to be unbiased. So how do you go about evaluating device performance? Well, I think the first thing to say is that there are many endografts on the market. They have diverse endograft designs, and therefore they have a different spectrum of both advantages and failure modes. And that for me really means that when you evaluate a graft performance, you've got to look at it using multiple parameters of performance and outcomes. Now, there's no doubt that if you think about AFX, a single specific failure mode such as type 3 has to be evaluated very carefully, and it has to be weighted accordingly, but within a holistic evaluation of graft performance. Similarly, I don't think you can rely on one data source to look at device performance. You need multiple data sets. Some have got to be independent, some actually have to allow comparative device performance, and some really you need to use big data and look at large sample sizes. And actually what I'm looking for is multiple data sets that have concordant outcomes and really no discordant outcomes. So data sets for me, valid, verifiable and unbiased. Think you've got to look for data sets that have a comparator. Think you have to look for some aspects of a data set that are independent and some with a large sample size. And the way we approached that for evaluating AFX was really to look at these data sets. And these are the 4 data sets that I look at pretty much routinely when looking at graft evaluation and graft performance. So we have the LEOPARD trial, which Chris will talk about in a little while. We have the VQI registry, so an independent comparative data set. We have our own internal data, which are based on the complaint system, so the medical device reports. And also we look at the literature through meta-analyses. And all of these data sets have their good parts and they have their less well evaluated parts. So let me just go through now our AFX results and what I look at. Clearly, our best source of data is LEOPARD. It's really the only randomized clinical trial in EVAR, and Chris is going to talk a lot about it in a moment, so I'm not going to show you any results. But it is interesting that nearly 30 years into this therapy, we have one randomized controlled trial looking at comparative device performance. If you look at the cardiology literature, they're actually littered with these sorts of trials. The LEOPARD trial, therefore, is a unique design outside really of an open EVAR comparison, and it uses direct methodology to give an evaluation of comparative graft performance. In addition to looking at comparative outcomes, it also actually allows us to benchmark our other data sets, both the complaint data sets and how VQI relates to the LEOPARD data. Let me talk a little bit about VQI. This has some significant strengths. As you know, It's a very large data set. Its disadvantages, however, are that it doesn't give you mid and long-term follow-up. So VQI is very good for perioperative events. It's very good really out to a year, but after that time, the follow-up tends to drop off. So we actually purchase VQI data on a quarterly basis, and what we get from that is the performance of AFX2 in a whole host of different parameters directly evaluated against all the other endografts in the market that are aggregated. Because of the terms of our contract with VQI, we're not allowed to use those data for promotional purposes, so I can't show you the absolute rates. But what I look at is the variance. And what I show you here is this table is a plus, where AFX2 is actually doing better than the comparator graphs, and a minus when there's a difference in a negative fashion. But what it is, it's an independent data set. It has very robust methodology, and unlike an IDE, it is real-world data and is unbiased by any manufacturer input. For us, it's updated quarterly, and I look at it and then look at LEOPARD and MDR and see if these VQI data are concordant. And actually, they pretty much line up on a 1-to-1 ratio. And for me, this really demonstrates the value of registry data in device evaluation and surveillance. If I look at our large big data set, this is MDR data. So these are complaints, and actually there's advantages to this in that it's a large data set. It's evaluating all of our patients, but obviously what we have to factor in is that reporting is not 1-to-1. So what's supposed to happen is every time anyone sees an adverse event or a complication, and that can be a clinician, a patient, an employee of the manufacturer, or even in the literature, those events are reported to the manufacturer. They're then reported in turn to the regulator, and they're made public, certainly in the US, in the board database. What we do is we look at an internal analysis of these complaints. We look at complaint trends, we look at a threshold for any investigation, and we have safety triggers. But of course, the problem is that there is not a 1-to-1 ratio between a patient having a clinical event and that complication being reported to the manufacturer. And actually, there was an FDA paper here on your right-hand side that actually stated that you cannot really use MDR data to establish rates of events, look at a change in rates of events over time, or compare event ratios, purely because what you don't know is the relationship between the number of clinical events and the number that are reported to the manufacturer. And actually the FDA, in some of their correspondence, thinks that that estimated ratio of reported to clinical events can be as large as 1 to 200. However, there is a way that those data can become more useful, and what we try to do is take our complaint data and benchmark it against LEOPARD and against VQI to try and understand how many clinical events end up with a manufacturer report. So these are data that Chris will show you. They're the type 3 end-elite rate in the LEOPARD trial for both the AFX system and the comparator graft. What we see is relatively low rates of type 3 in both randomized arms, but what we can do is use these rates to calculate a ratio between clinical events and reported events. And that's kind of what I'm showing you on this slide. If we look at the data that we have internally on aneurysm rupture rates and on type 3 end-elite rates, you can see there's a ratio of clinical events to reported events somewhere between 1 and 2. And actually, that's pretty good data these days, particularly on type 3 endolites, and we know that our field are really very good about reporting these. What that allows us to do is to use complaint data to actually monitor trends. And what I'll show you here is our type 3 endolite rate for the AFX platform. The AFX Strata patients are in grey, the AFX Duraply or AFX2 patients are in blue, and what you're seeing here is the sort of trend we want to see with Duraply and AFX2. That is a much lower type 3 endolite rate. We're confident on these data because they're benchmarked by both LEOPARD and VQI. We think that AFX Duraply is differentiated from AFX Strata, and actually we can further benchmark that with meta-analyses in the literature that gives us confidence on these data. So just to sum up then, before I hand over to Chris, for me, evaluation of endograft performance needs an assessment on multiple parameters of performance utilizing multiple data sets, and I'm looking for concordance in all of those data sets and those outcomes. Data, for me, has to be a mix. We need some that are independent, some that have comparators, and ideally data with large sample sizes and follow-up. Complaint data, you have to treat with a degree of skepticism, and really, I think they're useful, but only if they're benchmarked, and that allows them to be meaningful. The challenge for me is how do you maintain registry follow-up in the mid to long term? And actually, Chris and I will talk about a paper from Colombo a little bit later on today that actually linked VQI data with the Medicare data set to get good long-term outcomes, and actually gave some really interesting results. You know, acknowledge as a company, we've had some quality issues, some reputational issues previously, and actually, as most of you know, we had a reset of the company in terms of leadership and prioritization really last year. And we are absolutely committed now to being completely data driven in what we provide to you in a transparent manner. So as most of you will be aware, we have 3 platforms at the moment. That has its own challenges. 2 that are commercial or about to be commercial, and 1 still in trial. So with regard to the AFX platform, we're obviously committed, as Chris described, to long-term follow-up of the LEOPARD data. We love that trial. It's the only randomized trial in the space, and we think we'll continue to get very good information out of this trial out to at least 5 years and possibly longer. We have a new platform, hopefully, being launched in the first half of this year, the Alto platform, which is really the next generation of the polymer sealing ovation platform. Planning to launch that this year, and actually we're committed to a randomized controlled trial evaluating the performance of Alto in the long term against, again, currently available commercial endografts. The trial won't be the same as LEOPARD, but it will borrow many of the principles from that trial. And then 2 products in IDE trials at the moment, EVAS2, which is the NALEX 3.5 platform, and actually very exciting for us towards mid-year. We're actually going to be starting our complex aneurysm trial using chimney endografts with the EVAS platform in an IDE. So I'm going to leave you with this trial, really looking at our evidence activities and our clinical activities going forward. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm going to hand over to Chris.